necropolises, or the so-called necropolises of Banditaccia north of Rome, are emblematic for the Etruscan heritage of Italy, one of the most famous sites for sure. Basically, the site consists of hundreds of rock-cut chambers with something like beds in them. Why beds can be used only for burying dead people is not very clear to me. What about putting a mattress and sleeping on them? But that's not the most important. What was more interesting is that the roundish, presumably necropolises, were clearly built on older ruins. Heavily worn out remains of walls and structures could be seen throughout the complex. Do you notice how the Etruscan work actually looks like patches on older ruins? Here, for example, they patched a door or window in the ruins they found to turn them into their round necropolises. This is the backside of one of those alleged necropolises. If you take a photo from the front side, it's one of those typical round things, but this is what we see at the back side. It has nothing to do with round, it's obviously some sort of remains of heavily weathered rooms of some sort. And it wasn't just the necropoli of Cerviteri. We saw countless clear proofs that the ruins that bear somewhat Etruscan style and belong to the more recent period were clearly built on the ruins of older rock-cut stuff. For example, Castel dello So was one of the locations where we saw Etruscan-looking necropolises cut right in the middle into the old road. If we assume that these are indeed necropolises, I really doubt that the people that bothered enough to cut in the solid rock burial places for their respected dead members of the clan would do it in the middle of a functioning road, or even if these are dwellings, because to some people these actually look like habitable rooms and not necessarily necropolises. Still, you don't build the entry of your house in the middle of a functioning road. Probably they built them on a road that was already a historic ruin for them. So what I'm getting at, if we want to start understanding these ruins, we should stop thinking in terms of them belonging to a single culture. Maybe they belonged to a single civilization that had many layers over time and continued to thrive through a very long period, but possibly they also belonged to different civilizations stacked on the top of each other on the timeline, but they definitely did not belong to different civilizations existing simultaneously on different territories. And on the top of everything said so far about the older layers, the geologist in our group, he noticed that it seems as if there are two types of tufa stone. Tufa stone means solidified volcanic ash. So according to him, when the second layer was formed by the ash of a nearby volcano, it already covered rock-cut ruins. They were already ruins at that stage, and since these active volcanoes are extinct quite a few thousands of years ago, there is some possibility that thousands of years ago we found ruins that belong to somebody else that we met or not, and then we were cutting this newer layer of rock-cut ruins, and this continued for quite a long time, and eventually, at its very last stages only, it was used in Etruscan times. And it is exactly in those Etruscan times that people stopped cutting things in the rock and instead started building them out of blocks. First they were polygonal, then they became more or less standard, like bricks, and eventually people resorted to using simply undressed stone. So the fact that the ruins, commonly known as Etruscan, are built on the top of all the ruins is pretty obvious. One doesn't need to spend months in studies. Indeed, we noticed it in the very first 10 or 15 minutes when we visited the first site of our expedition, the necropolis of Banditacha, or also called the necropolis of Cerviteri, which happens to be probably the most famous Etruscan site. So, how come the Italian archaeologists are not talking about this? And by the way, this is yet another footage from that segment where it is clearly visible that the Etruscan alleged necropolises are dug in the middle of a road. And most likely, when the Etruscans did that, this road was already a historical ruin for them. Well, you don't hear about these different layers in the official sources because that history is not much based on actual study of old ruins, but it is rather based on pre-recorded songs that they learned in the university and that they're singing all their lives. These ruins are not given the attention they deserve in Italy as well as everywhere else. People see no value in them to the point that this necropolis of Cerviteri, which is by the way UNESCO protected site. So what that means is they collect some €10 entrance fee in a shiny modern office, and then the actual alleged necropolises are not cleaned at all. They are used, unfortunately, as toilets. I apologize. I hope that part could be blamed to the dogs, but then also it was used as a garbage depository, the ruins, the necropolises. This is terrible. It's not some sort of a big site difficult to maintain, it's just only a couple of 100 square meters. So the monuments of our past are in the hands of this type of people. And unfortunately, in the Park of the Monsters at the Bomarzo, I saw a disturbing example showing that these people go much further than simply neglecting the important historic sites and pretending that they don't exist in their so-called research. It's again a park with a high entry fee, and indeed the medieval statues are a wonderful historic thing to see. They are well maintained, people were working as we were walking on cleaning them. But what about the older ruins on which, or in some cases out of which, the actual medieval statues were carved? They're not at all difficult to spot. They're right under your feet as you walk through the park. They're just everywhere. And then this monster, amongst other things, actually his mouth is one of those eroded old caves. It doesn't come through very well in the photo, but it is different because the tool marks inside the mouth are like those of the old caves, while on the outside everything had the typical medieval tool marks like the other statues. And same with this one. This is actually one of those same rooms that we see everywhere in the old ruins, but it has been remodeled and all this, for example, the table in the middle could have been carved out of ruins of a column or something like that. And of course, nowhere in the official information about the park there is any mention of these ruins at all. For example, this is a chunk of something that officially should be labeled as Etruscan, judging from its style. This something has a depiction of a sirena on the other side, the same sirena that is depicted on the famous medieval statues of the park. But nobody even bothered to excavate or give any proper respect to this. It's just left out there in the bushes. It's not fenced like the other statues because it should not look like important thing. They didn't even bother to take it out from the ground entirely, although this should have more value from a perspective of an archaeologist because we have much less preserved Etruscan art than medieval. And then, as I walked further in the park, I was horrified to see how a child in front of my eyes was kicking this Etruscan statue. While all the medieval ones were included in the itinerary and were fenced and looked so respectable, this laid right on the public path. People were kicking it as they passed by. Here below it, there was another face carved. This is extremely valuable because Etruscan statues are very few. And as usual, the old ruins went hand in hand in the monastery park of Bomarzo with vehicle tracks. This is probably a single track, must have been an interesting cart then. But all problems with the necessary curiosity from people who would want to study these tracks one day was easily solved by putting a modern cement over them. So basically, in conclusion, in Italy, we saw what's happening everywhere else with these old ruins. The credit for making them is given always to somebody else, and that somebody else should be always a recent culture. Even when the stories look ridiculous, they still tell them, and actually, people still believe them because they are not informed about the actual ruins and because they don't know in what context to see them. And also because people have bought into this very misleading idea that a rock cut equals done by primitive people. Here we are still in Bomarzo. At places the rock appeared as if it has been scooped. Same like the Bobastro ruins of Spain. You can see that in the video series about Spain. And although the scoops are much bigger, they somewhat resemble, for example, the scoop marks at the Ashwan obelisk in Egypt. At least those are the most famous scoop marks. Also, there are some in South America and in Russia, amongst other places. More details in the Spain videos. So here we are still in the Bomarzo Monastery Park, and here, as basically everywhere in this central Italy, the region of central Italy, it is like this. You see things like this as you drive besides the road. Most likely the road you drive on is also a via cava. You can see because it is cut into the solid bedrock couple of meters deep, and then it has been just asphalted by the modern government and then remains like this. Some sort of rooms or just hints of them remaining on the ground, that there has been a wall here once upon a time. And there is no need to look for a historic site to find such ruins. They're just everywhere. Every patch of land that has not been plowed or built on. You go to a nature reserve. This is how the nature reserves look in Italy. Very natural, with natural man-made probably dwellings. The older the ruins, the more they resemble living quarters. The younger ones, like Etruscan looking, those are a bit necropolish in terms of looks. And then as you drive in the region, it is ruins again. All these on the left are reused rock cut premises. And what we are driving on is nothing else but an old road covered with asphalt. And when we peeked in some of these converted garages, they don't look like primitive caves inside, to be honest. They are quite spacious, clearly resembling living quarters with multiple levels, staircases. So, just besides the road, you see thousands of such chambers, premises. Those that are kind of still intact are most of them in use still. This is how some of the used ones look inside. We traveled through a territory, let's say, that was over thousands of square kilometers, and these ruins were just all over the place, in people's backyards, anywhere you look around. And that supposedly belonged to Etruria once upon a time. But how can we believe that all this is Etruscan if the same ruins are found also in Sicily, hundreds of kilometers away from the alleged Etruria? And then it continues eastwards of the alleged Etruria. This is on the east coast of Italy, the grottos of Polignano. Just look at their size. And do you really need any further proofs of their extreme age besides looking at them? What, the Etruscans came here on vacation and dug all this? If these grottos, which are fully recognized as man-made, that's the meaning of a grotto, man-made cave, were dug out by the Etruscans as well, there shouldn't be by now even as many as two stones still standing on the top of each other. On all other Etruscan sites, judging from what time has done on these grottos. Or did the hairy cavemen, dig them out? Engineering accomplishments of this magnitude are far above than the capacity of the cavemen that we have read about in our history school books. Maybe not above the capacity of the real cavemen, though. Or did the Etruscans go to China, Japan, Iran, and everywhere else and dug out all those, actually probably millions of rooms into the solid bedrock? In some cases, it's hard variety of rock. And these are not some sort of simple dwellings that simple men dug into the rock just because they were too dull to construct anything. The way we build nowadays, it's actually our things that are flimsy and short-lasting compared to their construction. Although poorly preserved, we have a consistent architectural style and repeating elements throughout the continents with these ruins, and although most of them bear tool marks that look manual, this is not always the case. For example, here in Turkey, we have smoothened walls that look machine cut and not hand cut, and even the places that do look as manual work could be interpreted in a different way. For example, some consider that what looks like rough chisel marks could be made just to support the plaster on it, and does not necessarily mean that the full room was cut from the rock manually. Besides that, we saw a good number of large halls, like for social gatherings or parking something big or storing things on a large scale. Like chambers the size of a good garage according to our standards, those were countless, but then we saw also some that looked like a place that you could park few wagons of your train, few compartments. In addition to that, we know, at least in Turkey for sure, that some of the underground cities are connected with each other with tunnels that are long kilometers. Such engineering projects are far beyond the capacity of unorganized bunches of men, and that's how the people who supposedly built all this, according to official history, were. We did not see that long tunnels in Italy, but this doesn't mean they're not there, because nobody is interested in excavating all these ruins. Parts of them clearly are still clogged with clay, only the tips stick out, and we did not see any excavation going on at all. The attempts to excavate anything of this sort in Europe are still in their infantile stage. Only Dr. Kusch is pushing a bit forward in this area from the German-speaking regions of Europe, and the keywords for this you can find a bit of information are mysterious underground tunnels stretching from Britain to Turkey. Very little information is available about those tunnels, but in general I'm getting the impression that they're connected with the extensive network of Erdstelle in those regions, especially Germany and Austria. Now, you may not have heard much about the Erdstelle, but this doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot of them. They're very similar to these rock cut ruins that you see now in Italy, but they're definitely of a smaller size. Yes, they have some larger holes that would befit humans of our size, but mostly they definitely seem to be dwarf dwellings. For example, an elder residents of a single village in Austria remember that when they were younger, there were some 60, 70 dwellings of this type in their village alone. And within a single generation, we have managed to obliterate, and now the locations of only 2 or 3 are known. The others have been just destroyed or buried with earth, plowed over. They're not protected, the Erdstelle. And many mindful people who live in these regions are trying to protest in some way. Hey, you're spending thousands to keep some sort of pottery in a museum safe, and you don't have any law or even any type of vocal encouragement for the people who have such things on their properties to at least respect them in some way. And there is a very good reason for which the Academia wants the Erdstelle obliterated. Because when a sensible person goes inside, he quickly figures out, wait a minute, this is 20 meters long tunnel that I can't even get through, and on the side it has cutting marks. If I can't even pass through, how could have another human went in and waving around hammers cut it? Some studies from Turkey show that actually those rock-cut cities were remodeled at a later stage by dwarfs and were reused by dwarfs. So apparently there was a good large numbered population of dwarfs throughout Europe and Asia. And they were one of the numerous parties that reused the rock-cut ruins. So, in terms of the big picture, we know little so far, but it is as follows. The initial layers are very, very old. For example, this is how a good number of rock cut streets end. Just the parts of them have fallen, disappeared in the abyss, and now there is only a vertical cliff left. And below in the valley, there would be like villages with medieval buildings. So apparently, this was a very long time ago when the streets were built. The earth has moved a lot since. And I would definitely call the older layers pre-flood, exactly pre-flood, because I see nothing else but a great flood that could have clogged probably stories high portions of them with clay, not some sort of cultural layers as they call it. They assure us that people were not sweeping, and that's why the dust and the dirt piled up to a few meters. No, it's just pure clay, and I don't see what else but the great waters could have stacked it up at such heights. And then they were used for a long time. We don't know yet. Was it all the same culture that existed for a long time? Or did different people find ruins and adapt it to their style? That we don't know yet. For example, the modern man is an example of somebody who reuses the old ruin without having any connection or understanding of the original builders. Hotels, restaurants, bars. We have made so many things inside these old ruins, but we are not very inquisitive to know who built them originally. For example, most of the non-destroyed ruins of this type in Italy are simply nature reserves. So when you go in an area with high concentration of such ruins, there would be signs put by the municipality. They would be encouraging you to carefully look at the various species of plants. At some places, there were boards with the colorful fishes that you can find in the local creeks. Or you would be invited to have a drink in a restaurant accommodated in one of those ruins. But I never saw a note, anything that would inspire the visitors to inquire into who actually built all this. This is probably what the Etruscans carved into the ruins they found. Were those ruins made by their forefathers? Or did they belong to somebody that the Etruscans had no connection with? We have no way to find out because the academia has created so much confusion around them that this has created very unhealthy, from scientific point of view, situation which makes studying them almost impossible while using the framework and vocabulary of the mainstream history. When I say using the vocabulary, I mean that the very notions, ideas, and terms used about the Etruscans are preloaded already with so much misunderstanding and confusion that anything you say about them to a person who has some faith in the mainstream history will just create more confusion. And so we went to the Etruscan necropolises in Tarquinia, famous for their original murals. And in the beginning, everything looked as expected, but then we saw this. This had very little to do with the style of all the other wall depictions we saw far here in Tarquinia and whatever Etruscan art we saw other places. Look at their muscles. This is how characters are depicted in children's books nowadays. Even the clothes is in that style. Is this some sort of really joke that somebody made a recent painting and they put a board for the tourists saying that this is a historic work? That's of course always a possibility, but as we saw more and more necropolises, it seemed that this could be fully legitimate paintings because they were mixtures of the old style, which looked exactly the way people should have been painting 2000 years ago, or according to some dating, the Etruscans lived 1000 years ago. But anyhow, the main point is that first of all we saw more works in this style with the muscles clearly shaped and all that, and then we saw works that were a mixture of the old style, technically called naive in art, and this cartoon style. This is one of the examples. The hands of this man are just a simple drawing, the way it should have been 1000 or 2000 years ago, and his legs are with the muscles and all this cartoonish style. So if these are genuine Etruscan paintings, the only thing that crosses my mind and may have some explanation as of their out of place seemingly style is what I read in the Fomenko's books on the new chronology, that actually even the works of the mainstream historians about the Etruscans are extremely contradictory. Usually you will read that the Etruscans were defeated roughly 2000 years ago, and that was more or less the end of their civilization. They were assimilated within the Roman culture. But if one delves in specialized literature, as usual, it turns out that this is one of the numerous possibilities. Often one will find references that there were, for example, wars between Rome and Etruria centuries after it should not have even existed. Many centuries. And just look at these depictions. They look somewhat too much Bible style. Is it possible that they actually depict personas from the Bible instead of the mainstream interpretations that we are given that these are purely Etruscan deities? Absolutely possible. And so here we can make another connection. The Etruscan relation with the last layer of the rock-cut ruins is undeniable. And most likely the Etruscans would have been the last one who were making rock-cut roads. Because we also saw different layers in the road building. Some of them seem to be much older than others. So the thing is that even on the sides of these roads, one can often see very clear tool marks. Now that's a bit of a different situation because the tool marks found in underground chambers, those have not have been exposed to direct rain and sun. So the presence of such exposed tool marks on the sides of streets by itself suggests that those streets may not be very old. Well, then maybe the Etruscan civilization did not come to an end that much long ago. Anyway, we have probably 1000 extra years added, as I have been suggesting in the Survivors documentary, so that automatically shifts them 1000 years ago if we maintain still some belief in the mainstream history. But then if we take into consideration the other options that the Etruscans continued to exist as a distinct culture up until a few hundred years ago, then at least we have one possible hypothesis that makes some sense and explains the paintings in the Etruscan tomes made with very recent style and the characters which seem to come from the Bible, and all that is consistent with the age of the tool marks on the sides of the roads. So the first few days we were walking in the forest and wondering, are all these irregularly shaped blocks actually megaliths? But then as we saw the nature of the stones in the area and noticed that some of them are like 20-30 meters long, some of the chunks, we decided that this must be the natural way the stones crack in this area, and that seems to be the case mostly. Yet no matter how much we believed in that, still, as we were walking, there were cases in which also the geologists in our group could not imagine how such a crack could have appeared naturally. For example, this is the exact spot where a rock cut road abruptly ends, cut by a cliff. Now, if you carefully look at the footage, you will notice absolutely regularly shaped, quite big blocks stacked on each other on at least 2 rows. And then here on the top you have a window of a dwelling of a hobbit, and below it it's really not clear where does the natural end and where the man-made starts, or maybe the hobbit-made would be more correct, because like this is how the rooms on the top look like. And then what will follow next is one of the most confusing things I saw during this expedition, and I really saw lots of confusing stuff. So here in between what should be 2 enormous boulders split by a natural crack, we see actually tool marks. And this would be like 30 meters high boulders. You can't even see where they end. And then this type of stuff would be directly below the room of the hobbit. This tunnel-like thing was some 20 meters high, and this is how it looked at the back end. If you go 10 minutes around the full boulder, that's how it ends eventually. And then the surroundings of this dwelling consisted of artificially manipulated stone. It didn't look like these are megalithic blocks stacked next to each other, but it definitely looked like wall that has been made even. Do you notice the discrete window at the top of another hobbit dwelling? And then near these walls, there were like pieces of something, like it looked like dressed stone with right angles, but that something seemed to have been tossed around by earthquakes or I don't know what, quite a lot. And this is how the portion of the stone that has been manipulated looks from above. Like the manipulated part would be at least 10 meters, between 10 and 20. So here is another, what I call hobbit dwelling. A discreetly carved window where the boulders split. And again, that's what lied below it, partially modified stone. These, what I call hobbit dwellings, seem to belong to a relatively somewhat more recent times. Probably the older structures consisted of those manipulated walls and the chunks with dressed stone that could be seen in the forest all around. And then somebody came later on and cut these dwellings in the stone. And the geologists in the group absolutely agreed with these distinct layers. And to me personally, out of all the ruins that I saw during the expedition, those of the Hobbit dwellings, that's how I call them now, were most precious. And also they were in their natural surroundings, still these ruins. What better food for a magical fairy or gnome to munch on than the right type of magic mushrooms? And it wasn't only fairies and forest trolls that were having feasts with the right type of mushroom. As it becomes clear from these old drawings, Christians not so long ago also knew very well how to use the right mushrooms. But modern men are different. Modern men watch TV. On TV, those sacred plants that have been helping man to journey into other worlds since time immemorial, those sacred plants are presented together with really harmful drugs as if they're the same thing. And this twisted, unreal new idea of what journeying in other dimensions is all about, that has been implanted into our consciousness since early childhood by the mass media and the educational system, is a major problem. The old ruins will forever remain mystery for us. Of course they will, because we have no clue what kind of beings built them. And that's a relatively minor aspect of the full problem. The worst out of all is that by severing the connection with the wisdom that we were acquiring from other dimensions, man became isolated from his real well-wishers and guardians, and this is what he turned into. Just see what kind of castles are amongst the rock-cut ruins. The ones on the backside, the more heavily eroded, could have easily been the height of a skyscraper. This is not the work of the savages, we are the savages. With the taxes that we pay daily, we finance wars that destroy many such castles, very actively and as we speak practically. Savages are those who destroy magnificent buildings, not those who build them. Somewhere around Etruscan times, people started building structures out of pieces of stone instead of cutting them as they used to do before. For example, here in Antica Norba we see a polygonal stone masonry, and you can clearly observe how much more recent it is in relation to the rock-cut ruins on the left side. It is hard to say if building out of chunks of stone was a sign of progress or exactly the opposite, because the rock-cut stuff is actually better. It is far more durable, it has insulation properties and so much more. But one thing is sure, that once we started using building blocks, after that we went straight into free fall in terms of quality. This is a piece of the most recent constructions in Antica Norba, but if you open images of, let's say, Nero's palace in Rome, who is considered to have lived at the times when Rome was at its zenith, its best, it was flourishing, he is considered the builder of all builder emperors of Rome. We see the same style, monkey quality work over there. Total degradation. But in terms of the interesting layers of Antica Norba, like this one with the polygonal megaliths, I will be making a separate video exactly about this, and especially about dating such polygonal megaliths, not only here but all over the world. I think that the mainstream history is wrong about dating them, and the alternative researchers probably even more so. In Italy, I noticed two distinct styles of polygonal megalithic work. And this is the first one, and this is the other one. Although the second one seems to be simply a later stage of digress from the first one, it is hard to say. Maybe they even existed simultaneously. But what is important is that those very same two styles can be noticed at the other locations around the globe where people did polygonal masonry. And I see the presence of both types of ruins at various locations around the globe as yet another proof that people were interacting really a lot still at those times globally. It wasn't just an occasional boat that crossed the Atlantic and taught few people how to do polygonal masonry. No, there seems that it has been a constant exchange, and even they could send enough people back and forth to have various styles developing parallel at the various locations. Parallel in time, I mean, just look at the similarity between the uh, Pumapunku Gate and that of Norba in Italy. Then, in terms of the second style of polygonal masonry that we saw in Italy, just look at its parallels with Peru again. And so, speaking of various styles of rock cut ruins, there was a place out there in the woods where the rock cut ruins had somewhat peculiar feel to them. They looked relatively young because there were some blocks as well as rock cut stuff. But the most remarkable about this particular style was their remarkable resemblance to Sigiriya. It's hard to say if those parallels with Sigiriya are pure chance or not. Also in South America we have similar platforms cut into bedrock. The only ruin in this forest area that has some sort of name and publicity is the so-called Pyramid of Bomarzo. And since we visited in mushroom picking time, we were lucky to meet a real guardian spirit of the ruins over there. This elderly gentleman really knows this forest very well, knows that it is literally full of ruins. We couldn't visit all the places, it's hectares in size, and we had only a couple of hours for this particular forest. But he knows of many such ruins. He's been making some attempts to clean them so that hopefully some people will notice them when they pick up mushrooms. He's been trying to attract public attention to these historic sites. He's been in touch with the local municipality, offering to volunteer his help, for example, to write signs, direction signs for paths so that people get some sort of information that there is something to be seen. And volunteering in many ways in discovering, providing information about these sites. And as you can guess, the local authorities were not at all interested. Also, in this very same forest, tool marks could be seen here and there. Mostly they were just too much weathered to say for sure that they were even tool marks. But at one particular spot, according to the men in the group, we definitely had a tool mark, and it really looked like as if it has been left by something similar to our modern tools for cutting stone. It was deep in the forest. This particular mark, far away from any definitely roads and maybe even pathways. I don't see how any modern tool could have functioned here because there would be no electric power. This was also in the vicinity, although the full complex of ruins definitely looked like as it has been chiseled out. At certain places like this one, it looked as if some sort of bagger was scooping stone. It was found beside the pathway. This is the actual pathway, and there were other funny marks on the pathway. First, we saw these parallel marks on a road. Although it was a historic road with old tracks, it just looked so modern that we immediately dismissed it as being modern. Initially, it didn't even cross my mind that same parallel lines we saw on historic road in Spain, where no modern equipment could have reached. And only afterwards, when we saw the same parallel lines on the side of a pathway that was often quite narrow, no question of any modern equipment reaching there, then we realized actually that these are definitely historic marks. And in the next episode, I'm gonna show you how the same marks we later on saw them crawling on the walls of the rock-cut roads. And then afterwards, at the Sigiriya-like ruins, Robin discovered the parking of the machine that was leaving those marks. Or at least that's one of the possible explanations. So.
This right here, we see this sort of repetition of mark that we
like
saw.
the tanks before
Like
on the street.
The tanks that made their way into the house now.
Yeah.
But right here,
Right.
same sort of reputation almost. And the same sort of like this angle where it's
Yes.
cut at this.
And then those same parallel lines would continue till cliffs, but not natural cliffs. The vertical wall would be like 20 meters high. What you see in the middle is only the middle platform before you reach the bottom, and at the bottom it's a rock-cut street with what looks like vehicle tracks on the walls. And then let's return up there where the parallel marks were. On the other side now of this fully man-made structure, it ends again with equally high wall just out there in the forest. Why? Was this some sort of quarry? If it was a quarry, it must have been a truly gigantic one because the full area, everywhere we could see around, I cannot even say how big because we saw no end, was dressed stone, just the ground completely. Just anywhere around that we could turn and look at, just cuttings, cuttings, cuttings. And that's till the end of the high cliffs. Quite high cliffs, by the way. And usually with a discreet small window looking at the valley from the cliff.
Oh, wow. Now, this is interesting. Cave's really low here, maybe like 3.5 feet. Little fella. Alright. Don't run out. You haven't even got the other side. Oh, there's another bat.
Oh, really? I'm not used to bats.
They don't want anything to do with you.
Yeah, cool.
So, speaking of tool marks, on many places we saw this. On the roads near the ruins, the old roads, and sometimes even on the walls. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish what is really ancient and what could have been modern works, but in these particular situations, it almost always looked rather ancient. If we assume that it was modern at all the locations that we saw, then we have a pretty strange situation of some modern equipment going inside these abandoned rock cut caves and doing something on them. In Baalbek there are similar marks, and also we saw them only at one place in Spain. That particular place in Spain was not accessible near Bucairent, not accessible by modern equipment. There was no road, so there could have been no way to power this type of heavy machinery. So although we saw lots of rock-cut complexes, we could never see a full underground city like, for example, Dironkuyu in Turkey, because simply things were not excavated. They would continue and they would be clogged with clay. So then we headed for Orvieto with the hope to see a real underground city in Italy. So Orvieto is built on high cliffs which are practically hollow inside with rock-cut chambers, and so I naively thought, okay, so here there is no way around. They must show us the underground city in the official, of course, paid tour offered by the local tourist center, of course. But it turned out they have found ways for everything. So first they showed us a map of the underground cities with black. These are the modern houses of Orvieto, and with red are the rock-cut chambers. But then when the actual tour started, it was hard to see actual old stuff because so much was newly built for the tourists apparently. I can't deny that the first few rooms had older elements and they were once part of this underground city network, but what they showed us was so heavily remodeled during medieval times and then for the tourists, and it was so much decorated with all kinds of recent elements that its historic value was actually ruined. And then most of the rest of the tour they showed us 100 or 200 year old mines. Somebody was mining ash over there because the volcanic ash is not fully solidified at that particular place. The deep wells were impressive though, but basically they took us to a recent modern mine and started telling us fairy tales over there in the mine about the Etruscans, because officially all these rock-cut ruins belong to the Etruscans. And so the tour guide started telling us in great detail um, all about the siege of the alleged Etruscan city. She knew everything with great detail by the date, how it was developing. At the end, when she took questions, I asked her, "Are there any old historic sources from which all this extremely detailed description of the siege is taken?" She replied, "Of course there are no old sources." And then she realized how stupid it sounds and said, "But we have books by modern historians, and that's how we know how it was all in reality." That sounds about convincing. If it is in a modern history book, it must be a reality, right? I also asked the tour guide about the underground pyramids supposedly being excavated in Orvieto. She didn't know anything about this. I don't know if this really exists. And then I also tried to somehow ask, then how do the other hundreds of chambers, thousands of them in Orvieto, how do they look like? I asked, are they Etruscan looking? How many floors are there? And the answer was that, you see, those are under private properties. And then later on in the tour, we were shown alleged Columbaris. Supposedly, the Etruscans breeded pigeons here. Actually, even mainstream historians who have studied the Columbaris don't agree that they're necessarily for pigeons. They don't look like made for pigeons. Pigeons reside anywhere around, but not in them, for the simple reason that they're too small for pigeons. The normal pigeons nest around these ruins, but never in them. There is no way of making a nest in these small holes. I raised this question to the tour guide, and she said, "Well, actually, you don't make a nest. The mother was sitting in one hole, the father in the next one, and in the third one, there were the children." Great. Actually, we saw countless such columbariums all over Italy, and they're part and parcel, so to say, of these underground cities, all the way from Israel to Spain. In Spain, also so many of them. For example, in Israel, where large flocks of pigeons still live around, you would see them really in the vicinity of such ruins, but they would never nest there. Moreover, that particular variety of Israel, they're much smaller than the usual pigeons, and still they don't go in. And the main reason for which actual researchers don't think that they have anything to do with pigeons is the absolute lack of any trace of pigeon droppings in any of the columbaries, absolutely all over the world. For example, the tour guide of Orvieto, she thought about the lack of pigeon droppings is solved easily. Well, somebody must have cleaned it, right? But even if we assume that for some unknown reason thousands of people have been brushing like crazy to meticulously clean all the columbaris spread over continents, still that will not make them likely candidates for actual pigeon breeding places, because even if the droppings are removed, still the color changes that such droppings produce on stone can't be removed. Such a color alteration is not noticed anywhere at all. And that's why researchers don't think these are pigeon breeding places, and yet this is repeatedly the version that is presented to the common layman and in all kinds of tours and even history books sometimes. And in this way, the simple people are again left with the impression that all the history is figured out, and people in the past, they were doing only simple things like breeding pigeons, nothing complex, never. So if the Etruscans were breeding pigeons in the small holes, then the big one must have been for dodo birds, no? Or, okay, let's be more realistic. How about peasants breeding pheasants? And although the stories of dodos breeding peasants and doves in small holes that they can't even fit in adds a lot to the credibility of the popular version of history that we hear, there is still a lingering doubt in my mind. Well, after all these columbaries are found on rock-cut ruins that are officially considered Etruscan necropolises. So they are offering me to believe that Etruscans were inviting pigeons to make nests and do the calls of nature a few inches from the decaying corpses of their respectable forefathers. Yet at other places that have official labels as medieval caves, supposedly carved by monks to meditate inside, again they are full top to bottom with pigeon nesting places. For example, now in Italy we saw Grotta de Monace, the cave of the nun. There was an official board next to the site explaining how it was basically medieval. According to that board, so what kinds of meditation were these nuns doing to have cut columbaries all over the walls of their grotto? So were these actually pigeon merchants doing meditation and carving caves for that? Or were they actually dodo merchants that were wearing the robes of nuns to evade taxes? Or are the penguins again taking us for a ride and telling us fairy tales just to create the impression that the history is all figured out? And it seems that eventually we managed to see impressive old ruins from the Aguil civilization in Orvieto, but it wasn't on the tour of the Orvieto underground, but at the supposedly medieval site of the St. Patrick's Well. Yes, clearly and undoubtedly there was some medieval stonework at the site of the St. Patrick's Well, and those were only the patches. Apparently in medieval times they only repaired the older well. Here is an example. Some of the original rock-cut structure remains, and the rest is repaired with medieval style brickwork. The credit for another similar and also very deep and impressive well, again in Orvieto, was given this time to the Etruscans. Well, probably that's somewhat closer to the truth. Yet another type of ruins that we examined as much as we could during the expedition were the alleged Anthropomorphous sarcophaguses and rock-cut tombs. Now, before this expedition, I didn't see any problem with the fact that at least some of them could be indeed burial sarcophaguses or tombs. But when you see the things in their actual context and you are there in person, everything changes. Actually, this type of rock cuttings, let's call them like that for now, are found in great abundance all the way from West Asia to England. Even England is full of them, not to mention Spain and Portugal, just hundreds, probably thousands of them. This is an interesting photo from France. Probably a fault in the earth layers has split the sarcophaguses in two, and one piece has gone further away. And still, the penguins wearing expensive suit continue to date both structures to the same medieval period, although the medieval building should have fallen apart if it lived through this fault that split the older sarcophaguses or alleged sarcophaguses or tombs. Why we have doubts? First of all, they are too small for our size of people. If this were indeed for burials, must have been some smaller race, definitely. We found some that we could fit in, but we had to look hard for them. So they definitely look anthropomorphic, but this is more symbolic. Actually, it's difficult to fit a dead or alive human body inside simply because they are always too narrow for that. So you're looking hard for a tomb that could accommodate you, and finally there is one that fits in length, but believe me, your shoulders, they never fit inside. So first of all, if these cuttings were for putting bodies inside, dead or alive, it must have been way smaller people than us. And then actually the main problem with all of them is that they collect water. Some of them seem to have some sort of a rim for putting maybe a lid. Okay, maybe the lid disappeared, we never saw any lids. But even if there were lids, still you would have anything that is inside always wet and rotting. Okay, let's assume that these were urns for ashes or some other type of burial that you don't put the full corpse. Still, you want the ashes to be all the time in the form of a soup. There was some suggestions, okay, maybe this was earth when this was dug out, and so the flooding problem would not have been there. No, they were not shoveled away when the stone was still earth. There are clearly visible cutting marks on the sides, same like with the rock cut ruins. This was stone when these anthropomorphic things were cut out, for sure. And then a small part of them actually had drainage holes. These holes were positioned in such a way that the liquid would go in another sarcophagus, and like this they would be connected in groups of 2 or 3. And actually many members of the expedition at the end were more inclined to see them as sort of tubs for bath ceremony or something like that. On the other side, anthropomorphic rock cuttings are usually found mixed with regular, just rectangular ones, and they are found also near to what clearly looks like residential quarters. Not only in Italy, everywhere, because they are just all over the place. This, for example, lie right besides the road at Via Marina. And this is not a dead-end road. It's a really big highway, wide. It very much resembles some sort of a marketplace. And again, it continues further in both directions. It doesn't end there. It means it was actively used as a road. So, do you bury people just like that on the side of the road? Or I should have said, do you just leave dead people just like that on the side of a main road? Was this like a barber shop where you could get your hairdo at the marketplace? Well, actually, to begin to study these ruins properly, first of all, we should start with the honest confession that we have no clue what are they even for. Not just the anthropomorphic cuttings, everything. We don't know what it was for, neither how it was made. Before embarking on this expedition, I set as a target, under blind conditions, the ruins we were going to visit and requested Mike Herberts from the very remote viewing academy to see what he can about them, and he actually described them very, very accurately. He even saw again under blind condition these huge megalith-like blocks, and I even asked him, could you see more details? Are these actually megaliths or what? And he said that they are like megaliths, but actually they were cut out of solid bedrock and then they poured metal on them and cracked the stone in a special way. And if you are not yet fully convinced that we know nothing about our actual history, watch the next episode. That one will confuse you completely, guaranteed. Plus you'll see exclusive stuff that you don't see anywhere else, like penguins riding scooters on Etruscan highways. The next hypothesis is actually that the Etruscans were pigeons. Well, you think it's crazy, but actually it's not, because if you see how high is this street here, and if you think that humans would work so hard, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, here we see arches from the ground, then you would think, yeah, maybe it was pigeons who pecked it all. Look at the peck marks on the wall.